All right, good morning, guys. Thanks for having me today. As she said, I'm Mr. Reynolds from the biology department. I teach academic biology and AP biology, as well as our online SWA biology classes. So I know a little bit about Darwin. This past spring, I took a graduate course through Clemson University in evolution, and I have a couple stories from there that I'll share with you that hopefully you'll enjoy, and I imagine you'll share with others because it's just darn interesting. I was asked to talk a little bit about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution, and specifically the term survival of the fittest, which actually isn't a phrase that Charles Darwin used, but we credit it to him and we use it to describe his theory. So I'm going to talk a fair amount today, but I've tried to include some video clips where we get into an activity at one point. But I really want you to listen carefully to this story because this is an important story. It's a story that changed the way that we as humans thought about the world around us. And in that sense, it was revolutionary. And Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was revolutionary. We'll talk about why that's the case. Before I get started, a quick question for you. I know, I recognize some of you from my biology classes, so I know the answer for you. But first of all, everyone here has had biology. Is that correct? Right, I want to ask you to give me on a scale of 1 through 5. 1 means I remember nothing about Charles Darwin and evolution, and that may be because it's been a while, or that also could be because, unfortunately, our evolution unit is the last unit in biology, and it gets cut out sometimes, and we just don't get to cover it. So 1 would be, I don't remember anything, and that's okay. In Mrs. Lumen's class first period, just about everyone was a 1. 5 would be, I could stand up here and Mr. Reynolds would go take a coffee break because I got this covered and I can teach this. So where are we at? 1 through 5, where do you feel about your experience with this topic? Okay, I'm actually glad to see lots of 1s and 2s because you're not going to be bored because this is new information for you. All right, I'm going to put down the lights a little bit and this is okay. Let's go. So this is Charles Darwin, and you'll notice I have a picture of Charles Darwin on my tie, and whenever we see pictures of Charles Darwin, he kind of looks like this. He's an old man, not necessarily frail looking, but he's up there, right? Charles Darwin did all of the work we're going to talk about today in his youth. And so even though we remember him as this really old, wise-looking man with a big beard, this was not when he put forward the theory of evolution. It was when he was quite younger, and I want to tell you a little bit about his background because I think his background is interesting and it kind of led him towards this trip that he took around the world where he collected lots of information and then was able to put together a theory. So who is Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin was born in England in the early 1800s, 1809. And at the time he was born, if you were to travel back in time to England and ask people, why are there so many different kinds of life on Earth? Virtually everybody would answer what? Whether you're talking to a scientist or a religious leader or just a kid walking down the street, why are there so many different types of life on Earth? They wouldn't have answered evolution, not in the early 1800s. Now, certainly that's an answer that we'd expect for people that have had a science class, yeah. What was the explanation for why we have so many different types of life? Or maybe simplify it, where did life come from? God, right? The Earth is 6,000 years old. All life exists now in 1809 as it did when Earth was created and life was created. That was the scientific explanation for life. Well, that's nice.
Oh, it's awesome. That's great.
That's awesome. I don't experience that back in my little company, you know?
And we also use band music.
Oh, yeah. This is a lively place. I love it. So, when Charles Darwin was growing up, this was the explanation for life. We have so many different types of living things on Earth because just that's the way they were made. And as a child, Charles Darwin was incredibly interested in nature. He wasn't so interested in church. He went, but he wasn't so interested. But he loved to spend time out in nature, taking notes. I know when we think of what we do as kids now, taking a notebook into the woods isn't something that most of you probably did as kids. But for Charles Darwin, that fascinated him. And of course he grew up and it was time to go to college, and his father was really pushing him towards medical school. So he spent a couple of years in the University of Edinburgh in their medical school program. He still loved nature. He spent his free time out in nature, but as part of his education he had to attend surgeries, and Charles Darwin hated surgeries. He was disgusted by them. He did not enjoy his time in the surgical centers, and he knew he had to make a change. And so one of the things that I find most interesting is, even though he didn't have a great interest in church, he decided to leave medical school and he was going to study to become a member of the clergy. He was going to become a religious leader. So for a couple of years he attended Christ College in Cambridge. And once he was there, he knew this wasn't really for him. He didn't have interest in his studies at all. He knew he wasn't going to plan to be a religious leader. What he was really interested in was nature. He wanted to be a naturalist. And so an opportunity came up. There was a ship, Her Royal Majesty, the Royal Beagle, and this ship was going to travel all around the world for several years. Charles Darwin knew he wanted to explore more than the woods and the fields and the streams and the rivers around his house in England. He needed to get on this ship and travel around the world. His dad didn't want him to do it. His dad wanted him to be a doctor. The captain of the ship didn't want him to do it. He wasn't a trained scientist. Here's this kid who dropped out of medical school, he's dropping out of religious school, and wants to ride on the ship, taking up a place and meals and space where an actual scientist or a ship worker should be. But eventually they agreed, and Charles Darwin then spent several years on the voyage of the Beagle. This voyage of the Beagle is where this idea was born. The idea of evolution of life on Earth, creating our diversity of species. So what was the voyage of the Beagle? Here's a sketch of the ship. This is your pretty standard mid-1800s British ship. But this ship, the advantage of the ship is that it went to lots of different environments and ecosystems. It left Europe, spent some time on the east coast of South America, worked its way around South America, stopped at a whole bunch of little islands in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Then made the big trip across the Pacific to Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, and then worked its way to Africa, back to South America. So if you're Charles Darwin, if you're interested in observing nature and writing down what you observe about specimens that you collect, this is the perfect trip. This is a dream cruise, because you're going to get to see what life looks like in Australia, where we have lots of rainforests, and we have lots of really dry desert areas, so lots of different places where life lives. And then you're going to go to Africa, where it's hot and it's dry, but there are also places where it's very rainy and very covered in plants and growth. And then you're going to go to South America and then back up to England, which is a very different climate than all of those places. So for Charles Darwin, he spent these years looking, listening, and observing. Looking, listening, and observing. That's the work of science. How do we know about the world around us? We look at it, we observe it, we listen, we record information. And so Charles Darwin filled up many journals with observations about the tortoises that live in the Galapagos Islands, the birds that live in the Galapagos Islands, or the snakes, or the fish, or the koalas that we see in Australia. And when he came back from his time on the Beagle, he didn't go out and publish this book, The Origin of Species. You guys are reading Origin of Species, right? You read part of it? So he didn't get off the ship and publish it. It took him 20 years. He spent 20 years of reflecting and reviewing the information that he gathered on that trip before he decided to publish this book. And it actually probably would have been longer than 20 years. He wasn't ready to publish yet, but other scientists were coming to the same conclusion that he's at, and he wanted to be the first to publish, so he rushed into publishing. And of course, we remember him and not some of the other guys who had very similar ideas at the time. So for this course, you're probably less interested in Darwin's life. So that's his life in a nutshell. I'm not going to tell you more about the voyage or his life, but I want to talk about his ideas and what we find in the theory of Origin of Species, about the theory of evolution. So I mentioned he published it 20 years after the voyage, November of 1859. In November of 1859, England was very much like England in 1809. The Earth is 6,000 years old. Why do we have diversity of life on Earth? Well, many people would still say it was just created that way. But there was also a school of thought that said, well, we noticed that a giraffe has a really long neck. So maybe the reason the giraffe has a long neck is because it eats from trees, so it's constantly stretching its neck. And if it stretches its neck, it makes it a little longer. And then when it has little baby giraffes, their necks are a little bit longer because mommy and daddy giraffe were stretching their necks. And after many generations, life changes that way. So we started to open up to the idea that life changes. We're not fixed. We're not the same that we've always been. But it was still an idea that was marginalized. It wasn't very much accepted by the wider scientific community. Charles Darwin's book was revolutionary. What do I mean by revolutionary? It was revolutionary because it changed the way that people thought about life very quickly. Within a matter of years, Charles Darwin's explanation of life became the accepted explanation by the scientific community. And another thing that made it revolutionary was these ideas outlived Darwin. it outlived many of his critics. The theory of evolution is still the accepted scientific explanation of why we have so much diversity of life here on Earth. I mentioned it changed minds very quickly. We're talking like 10 years, 15 years, changed people's thinking that they've held for thousands of years about life. And so the book was a big deal. Anytime you do something that's revolutionary, you make a lot of people mad, right? Charles Darwin didn't become very popular because of this book. He actually he received threats. There were articles written in papers that were very negative about him and his family. Members of his family were embarrassed. But of course, his ideas over time became our accepted scientific explanation. So let's dig into the book. Let's see what are some of the big ideas. And then I want to spend most of our time today talking about this concept of natural selection and survival of the fittest, because that's what's going to guide you through this course, I don't know. All right, so two big ideas from Darwin's book. First, the idea that evolution occurs was revolutionary. The idea that life does change. It's not fixed. If we went back 1,000 years earlier than Darwin's time and looked for fossils of the species living on Earth, they would not look the same. They would have changed because evolution does occur. So in other words, organisms change over time. Life has changed as descendants diverge from common ancestors. We can unpack that term a little bit. Converge from common ancestors, meaning we have a fish that looks a certain way, reproduces a certain way, has certain traits. And I'm not saying that that fish just changes into another thing. I'm saying that fish results in many new species of fish as adaptations and modifications are added over thousands of years. So the descent part of this is that we're having many species descending from a common ancestor, and all of those species share that same common ancestor even though they look different. We'll bring that concept back up at the end when we talk about how this applies to humans, okay, and some misconceptions that are out there. So that was one idea, just that evolution occurs. The other idea, probably the more important idea, is what is the mechanism that drives evolution? What causes living things on Earth to change? And so our second bullet here, the other idea is that evolution occurs by natural selection. Go ahead and underline that. I have it written out for you there. Underline that term. That's an important term. So what is natural selection? Well, we have a very booky definition here, and then we'll kind of give you lots of stories and examples to give you a better understanding of this definition. Natural selection is the process in which living things with beneficial traits produce more offspring than others do. So if you have traits that make you better adapted, you have a better chance of survival. So we can tell a very easy story about this. You don't have to write anything. You can put your pens and pencils down and listen to the story. If we took a class trip right now to the East Woods, how many of you have been up to the East Woods? Okay, so go across Breezewood, up by the cross-country track to the Environmental Center. I know Mrs. Brobeck was there in 7th grade.
I was.
Do you remember the Chesapeake Bay song? Somebody was just telling me
Hey,
that.
hey.
Yeah, I used to remember that. You guys remember the Chesapeake Bay song?
No?
We're all Southwestern people.
Yeah.
So if we go to the East Woods and we observe some of the animals living there, there's a species of brown mice that lives in the woods, and every time a mother mouse is pregnant, we can expect her baby mice to be brown. Very occasionally, there's a mouse born with a mutation that makes them white, and that mouse probably isn't going to live very long. Why? You can see it. The two bald eagles that live over by Cadorus very easily can swoop down and eat that mouse, or take it back to the little baby eaglets that were in the nest. And so, in that scenario, some baby mice are born with an advantage over others. That advantage gives them two things. It gives them the chance to survive and live, and if they survive and live, they also get the chance to do what? Reproduce, and pass on those genes that have an advantage to the next generation. So that idea of natural selection boils down to that story. Okay? Pretty simple concept. But let's kind of see some other factors that Darwin identified that play a role in natural selection. This is my most important slide for the day. Okay? This is taking the whole book and kind of boiling it down into 4 bullet points. What is natural selection? So the first aspect of natural selection says that in order for selection to occur, in order for nature to get to pick which organisms are winners and which organisms are losers, there has to be variation. The population has to be different in some way. What was the variation in my mouse story? The color, right? Some mice were born with white, some with brown. They weren't identical. Let me tell you about bananas. This is a great story. I love this. This is an interesting story. How many of you are banana lovers? All right, what's wrong with you people? I don't like bananas. But my son loves bananas. So there's variation in genes right there, different flavors. But if you're a banana lover, you could probably, if I said to describe what a banana tastes like, that's pretty hard to describe, but you can kind of in your head, right, without saying it loud, I know what a banana tastes like. How many of you, though, like banana flavored candy, pies, the things that have like a bright yellow, really sweet flavor? Anybody like that flavor? Okay, a couple people like that. I like, my kid had banana baby food, which tasted very different than a banana that you would eat, and I like the banana baby food flavor because it tasted better to me. So let me tell you about those two flavors and how that ties in with variation. 50 years ago, if you went to a supermarket anywhere in the world and bought bananas, you would be buying a species of banana called the Gros Michel, also known as the Big Mike. The Gros Michel or the Big Mike. It was bigger than the bananas we eat today, and it had a different flavor. It was very, very sweet and more tender, and we actually designed banana-flavored foods off the Gros Michel. There was a problem with the Gros Michel. Every single tree on every single continent that grew Gros Michel bananas was a clone from one original tree that we cloned. And by clone, I don't mean like a big scientific cloning process like cloning humans. We just took a slice off the tree and we planted it and got a new tree, and then we sent it to South America or Hawaii or Australia or places where bananas grow. Every single tree in this world was a clone of a single tree. They were all genetically identical. And there was no problem with that, because if you got a Gros Michel banana from South America or one from Africa or some other tropical place, they tasted the same, they looked the same. People that ran supermarkets loved it because they always knew what they were getting. Problem. In the mid to late 50s, there was a fungus in Panama that started to attack banana trees. And it wiped out all the banana trees in Panama. This fungus was so potent that if you walked through a field of these dead banana trees, and then you went and showered yourself and got on a plane and went to another continent and walked through a healthy banana field, that banana field would die very quickly because these tiny spores could stick to your skin, stick to your clothing, and travel. And since there was no variation in the banana population, they all responded exactly the same way to the fungus. They died. And about 50 years ago, every single Gros Michel banana tree in nature was killed off. Now that's a problem, because here in the United States, we eat bananas as a side dish, as a breakfast, right? We wouldn't die if bananas were no longer around. But in some places, bananas are their staple crop. They stay alive because they have bananas to eat. So scientists had to figure out a solution to this problem. And what they did is they found another species of a banana called the Cavendish, which is what you eat today, the Cavendish banana, and they did the exact same thing. They took pieces of it, they spread it around the world, and so now every single banana, that's the regular yellow bananas at grocery store, is a Cavendish banana. In January of 2016, we found a fungus that's attacking Cavendish bananas in some places, which scientists think means in just a few years, all of our banana crops are getting wiped out. The bananas that you know now most likely are going away because there's no variation. There can't be winners and losers. There can't be banana trees that are more fit to fight back against that fungus because they're all genetically identical. So what does that mean for bananas? Well, scientists know this problem is coming, and they're working on creating a strain of bananas, genetically modified and creating a strain of bananas that are resistant. And so kind of a sidestep from this conversation, I know many of you are familiar with the GMO debate, right? Should we eat foods that are modified or not? We don't have time to get into that today, but something I want you to think about. Without GMO bananas, there will be places on Earth where starvation is going to be a big issue because of bananas. And so you might come down on either side of the issue, but realize that there are reasons that we do GMO, not just for the sake of it, not for bigger profits, right? But for life-saving reasons. So that's variation. In natural populations, we find variation mostly because of mutation. Think back to biology. What's a mutation? Genetic mutation. I see some of my bio students out there. Yeah.
I don't really exactly how to word it, but it's
That's
kind
okay.
of like a wrong thing in your DNA strand, like something's completely different than what it's supposed to be.
That works perfectly, right? Any change in your DNA, any change, the letters, remember A, T, C, and G, those codes that make up your DNA, anytime they get changed, that's a mutation. A mutation could result in a new trait, that's a good thing. It could result in you missing some structure or function that you're supposed to have, that's a bad thing, or it could have no difference at all. Right? If it's a gene that affects the texture of the hairs that grow in the bottom of your earlobe, who cares? If it's a gene that affects how your palate forms in your mouth, big deal, right? So variation is a result of mutation. But another big way we get variation is how. And I'm going to set you up to think about it like this. We have our parent generation. Think about your family. If you know all the biological members of your family, and you don't think of somebody else who you know the biological members of their family, think about the grandparents, think about the parents, think about the offspring. There's a lot of variation there. They don't look like twins. Why? It's not that they have lots of mutations. What's that? Why do they have different DNA? Why does a kid have different DNA than parents?
Like the dominant recessive genes.
How do they get different dominant recessive genes? You're right, that's why we have different appearances.
Maybe it carried down through generation, like the dad might have something that he doesn't show, but it be in his genes and he passes on to his child.
You're absolutely right. How does he pass it on to his child? Reproduction. The parents have sex. So sexual reproduction is the main driver of variation in natural populations. Sure, a big thing is mutations that can happen, but more likely the reason one generation looks different than a previous generation is because of sexual reproduction mixing up genes. And so Darwin noticed that in natural populations there was a wide variety of traits. And if there's a variety of traits, then we can have a situation where there's winners and losers. Organisms that get to survive, organisms that can't survive. All right, second big idea. Darwin noticed that there was overproduction in natural populations. If there's plenty of food available, if there's plenty of resources, then organisms are going to overproduce. They're going to mate wildly and have lots of offspring, and the population gets huge. Humans are a great example of this. For a long time in early human life, we had limited resources. There wasn't a lot of food, we didn't have a lot of shelter, we didn't know how to defend ourselves, and so the population on Earth stayed very low. And then we learned how to make more food, how to farm, how to preserve food through the winter, how to build houses to protect ourselves, and once resources were no longer an issue, overpopulation of the Earth. We are way over the population that scientists believe is a sustainable population for the long-term health of our planet. But we don't have to use a drastic example like that. If we go back to the East Woods and watch the deer, if there's plenty of food available, what happens to the deer population? It goes up. And why is that a problem for the deer? Where are hunters in here? You should know a little bit about this. Why is that a problem for deer if their population skyrockets? And then what happens to them? They die, right? They starve and the population could collapse. So one of the reasons that we encourage hunting in Pennsylvania is to help maintain the population of deer. People have different feelings about hunting, but we know that it plays a role in population control. But why is overcrowding important to evolution? If overcrowding or overpopulation occurs, then there's competition for resources. And whenever there's competition, some people are winners and some are losers. In terms of evolution, whenever there's competition, some organisms are going to be more adaptive than others, meaning they have a better chance to survive and pass on their genes. So that's the second part to natural selection. Variation means different traits in the population. Overproduction means there's going to be competition, so there's going to be winners and losers. And the third part is the result of 1 and 2, adaptation. Back to my mouse story. Did I tell you a story that sounded like this? We had these brown mice. Did I tell you the mouse story? Okay. I started to get confused with the first period.
yeah.
Did I tell you about the environment changing to being very snowy? I did. Okay. So let's say the population changed to be very, very snowy. And now, the determination of which organisms are more fit than the other is going to change. Some are more fit, no longer the ones that were fit before. That little white mouse that was easy ego food before now is born with a great advantage. It has the best chance of growing up, reproducing, and making a white offspring And so over time, we might see that population evolve or change into a white population. What is the adaptation part of that? Well, I didn't say that the mouse just ran out, a little brown mouse ran out on a snowy day and it grew its white fur so that it could avoid the eagle. That's not how evolution works. Individuals don't just spring up adaptations during their life. Adaptations are a result of natural selection on these things. The white mouse got to survive, so it's more likely that the next generation has white fur, and even more likely that the next generation has white fur, and maybe 100 years later we say, okay, this white fur is an adaptation. It was a result of natural selection, not some kind of magical change inside of a single organism. And then the conclusion to this idea is descent with modifications. The idea that as living things reproduce, their descendants have these modifications embedded in their genes. Right? Evolution actually changes the genome over time. And so if we look at a fossil history of elephants, we see that as we go back, elephants' trunks were smaller, and then they were non-existent. Well, that trunk is a modification that they developed through natural selection. And as they descended, the animal became modified. It became changed. So now we can go back to that original question of where does diversity of life on Earth come from? Charles Darwin would say all of the different types of animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, protistans, those are all the kingdoms of life, all the different types that we see are a result of millions of years of natural selection causing descent with modification, changes that became part of their genes. I have a cool video clip that's going to demonstrate this. But before we go to that, do you have questions about this concept, this idea? Anything you want me to clarify?
I'm learning as much as the kids are. This is
All right,
great.
good. All right. So let's see this in real life. I told you the story about the mice. I told you the story about the banana. But you need to see this because there are critics that say, yeah, you know, this story sounds good, but we can't actually see evolution. We can absolutely see evolution. We can't see human evolution because we can't go back in time and watch this occur. We'll talk about that later in the period. But we can watch organisms evolve now if they have a quick lifespan. Bacteria. So your entire body is covered in a layer of bacteria. I always tell my biology kids this, they're grossed out. That layer of bacteria is excellent. It's good for you because it eats funguses and viruses and things that are trying to grow in your body. So we like our bacteria. Bacteria has a very quick reproductive cycle. Some bacteria reproduce every 20 minutes. So let's think about the math on that for a moment. 20 minutes later, 2 bacteria, because they just split in half. 20 minutes later, 4. 20 minutes later, 8, 16, 32, 64. If we go 24 hours forward, if we took one bacteria off of Bubba's head and put it in a petri dish, and we gave that bacteria unlimited food, unlimited resources, so we don't want anything to slow its growth because it's competing for food. And we set the time at 10:21 Monday morning, and we come back and look at this petri dish at 10:21 on Tuesday morning. Now remember, one bacteria is microscopic, but when there's a lot of them, we start to see a little clump. How big do you think that clump is? Just throw a wild guess out. We have no reason to get this right, so don't be afraid. How big is that clump after 24 hours? Microscopic bacteria.
Size of a quarter.
Size of a quarter is big, right? Compared to microscopic bacteria, a quarter's big. Not nearly big enough.
How small?
Much bigger.
That was the entire petri dish.
The entire petri dish, way too small for 24 hours.
Covers Bubba's body.
Bubba's body, incredibly too small. Never hear that one again. The entire surface of Earth in a layer 6 feet deep after 24 hours of bacteria growth, if they had unlimited food. Now they don't have unlimited food, they compete for food, so their reproduction rate slows drastically. But what that means is we can watch many generations happen in a petri dish very quickly. So we can watch these genes being passed on, we can watch them responding to their environment, and we can actually get a visual of evolution in action. This video was viral over the weekend. Probably not on your Facebook feeds, but I have lots of friends in the biology community, and it was very popular. So, oh, that's perfect. I'll include this for Monday. So we're going to watch evolution in action. And this word, I just made this phrase up this morning, in vitro evolution. In vitro is a scientific word that means in the lab. You might have heard it with in vitro fertilization before, where for infertile couples, they might have their eggs and sperm taken and in the lab we make sure that they're able to be fertilized, and it's a very normal thing that happens a lot, right? And you end up with a perfectly healthy baby, and it's a good thing. But the in vitro word just means in the lab setting. So I call this in vitro fertilization. We're going to watch, excuse me, I call this in vitro evolution. We're going to watch this in a, we're not going to watch fertilization.
Thank you.
So what are we what are we watching here? This yellowy stuff in the background is bacteria in a petri dish. That's what it looks like if you let it grow for a day. It fills that space and then it doesn't grow anymore because it runs out of food. These little white discs we would have put on this petri dish before the bacteria. They're soaked in antibiotics. Their job is to kill bacteria. This one is a 100 power strength antibiotic. This one is a 10 power strength. And what do you notice? The bacteria can grow pretty close to that disc because it's a weak antibiotic and they can survive. It doesn't really wipe them out. Around here, no bacteria are growing. That antibiotic is killing them. So this isn't the video. This is just a picture I pulled to give you an idea of how we grow bacteria in a dish. Take a look at the video clip. I think you'll find this interesting and then probably scary. Mrs. Lewin was terrified by this. Okay, same thing happened this morning. I couldn't click that. So I'm just going to go to YouTube. I'm going to click second. There's a club. Look at that. We're going to keep. Sorry.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in.
All right, so let's dig into this a little bit more. So this is a setup where these lanes have the antibiotic trapped in them, but because we put a thin liquid across the top, the bacteria can swim. They can grow anywhere. Okay, we're going to start the bacteria here and here. And on those end bands, remember, so there's no antibiotics. So that's a great environment. There's plenty of food. There's nothing trying to kill the bacteria in those spaces. So let's come up with a prediction. Talk to somebody near you. What's going to happen in the first couple minutes as the bacteria are trying to colonize or grow in these outer bands? What's going to happen? What are we going to see? Okay, somebody willing to share with us? What might we see happening in these outer bands where they have a great place to live, no antibiotic, just lots of food and space to make? I heard the correct thing you tossed around. Okay.
So our group said that because they're gonna grow on the outside quicker because there's something that it's the perfect space for them, but they're gonna adapt slowly as they get more and more because it's just small amounts. They're gonna adapt to it, and then by the time they're fully adapted, they'll be able to grow in the middle.
Okay, I like that prediction. So they took it a step further, which is great. They're going to be just fine, right? The bacteria is going to grow quite well. And we expect to run into problems because this first lane is supposed to kill them off. But if any bacteria have a mutation allow them to survive, that barrier shouldn't be a problem for them. And so we should see evolution occurring over a couple hours in this huge petri dish, this 9-foot-long petri dish. So here we go.
The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
Let me go back to that last image. So we talk about evolution as a theory of evolution, and that word is a bit loaded. People interpret that word theory a little bit differently. So before I comment on what we saw in the video, I want to break down that word theory for a moment. I've had students in my biology class when we discuss evolution say, yeah, evolution is just a theory. And I say, absolutely, it's a theory. But I think our definition of theory was maybe different, their interpretation of mine. So let's go back to general science for a moment. And think about the difference between a hypothesis in science and theory in science. A hypothesis and a theory. Go ahead again with somebody near you, see if you together come up with the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. All right, someone from the back row. Theory of, what's a theory versus a hypothesis?
It's okay if you're wrong.
That's absolutely fine if you're wrong. It's been 3 or 4 years since you've had this made. No? Yes, go ahead.
Hypothesis is like what you, kind of like what you predict before you get any evidence or like test it. And a theory is like after you test it like a little bit. It's like what you believe is like happening.
Yeah, I love every part of your answer except the phrase "little bit" in there. I'll go and use a lot bit, right? So yeah, absolutely. Theory is this guess you throw out to set up an experiment. My hypothesis is that if I throw some new fertilizer, a new brand of fertilizer in my garden, that my plants are going to grow better. Could I test that? Absolutely. I just do it, and after many years, I might make an observation. Theory is a word that takes on much more importance in science. Theory is the result of many, many years and thousands of scientists worth of research that provides evidence to support a conclusion. It is the accepted scientific explanation for something. So when we talk about theory of gravity, can we prove gravity? Can we see gravity? No. But we have a theory of gravity that tells us when I let go of this pencil, it's going to fall to the floor. And then we see lots of evidence to support that. We see evidence every day. The fact that you're sitting in the chair is evidence to support that theory, even though we can't see gravity. We know about theory of evolution and this theory of natural selection. Even though we can't go back in history and watch life change, we should expect to be able to make observations and collect evidence to support that theory, for it truly to be a theory. And so I asked you to make a prediction about what would happen here. According to Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection, we would expect to see exactly what we saw in the video. So what makes a theory a really strong theory, what made Charles Darwin's theory of evolution revolutionary and able to survive for hundreds of years, is that we continually find new evidence that continues to support the theory. And each time we do it makes it a stronger theory. So be careful with that word theory when we describe evolution. But yeah, what we saw here was evolution in action. This is scary because this is exactly what we as humans did over the last 50 or 60 years in modern medicine. And we've created these super bugs that we actually don't have medicine to treat now. So what's this application to humans? Well, they used a bacteria that's not harmful to humans, but let's take one that is. MRSA. You heard of MRSA? Staph infection. You get it on the skin and it creates an irritation, but if you get it in your body, it actually can start to eat away at tissues and it can lead to death. 50 years ago, if there was a bacteria like MRSA around, we could use any antibiotic, penicillin, and it would kill the bacteria, because the bacteria didn't have a way to survive. But then we kept giving lots of antibiotics to lots of people, and eventually some bacteria were born with a mutation, there's variation. There was overpopulation of the bacteria, they grow very quickly, and so they developed that adaptation, resistance to antibiotics, and they were able to survive. So we had to create a stronger antibiotic, and we did, and that helped for a while, and then bacteria became resistant. And now we're at the point where there are strains of MRSA that are not resistant to any antibiotics that we as humans have, which is scary. We have other ways to battle them that aren't nearly as effective, but we can battle MRSA. But we as humans, especially here in the United States, have to respond to this by reducing the amount of antibiotics we prescribe to try to slow down this.
I read an article on that doctors are now going to not prescribe antibiotics.
Yep.
That's where they're leading to.
Yep, let your natural system
Yes.
fight the infection.
Because I don't know about you, my doctor doesn't prescribe penicillin anymore, because it just doesn't, it
Right.
doesn't work.
It's not effective
Yeah.
anymore. Yeah.
No, but if they don't prescribe like any kind of antibiotics, and it just gets like worse and worse. Then
The MRSA?
I feel like anything.
Well, I mean, the truth is there are people that die from it now when they get it because
Yeah.
you can't fight it. If you have a pretty strong immune system, your body has ways to fight it, and you're probably okay. But our children, elderly, people that have immune deficiencies, things like AIDS, are pretty susceptible to dying from these things.
The article I read was more of like the common cold. If you get sick, you go and you're expecting to get an antibiotic for like a sinus infection or a common cold,
Yeah.
and they're gonna stop giving anything
Yeah.
unless it's super serious.
Especially because the common cold is a virus, and so antibiotics have no impact on viruses, but we still prescribe them
Yeah.
to make people feel, because people want the antibiotic to feel better. It's not really helping them, it's just creating this problem.
Still for like strep throat, because strep can potentially kill you.
It can,
They'll
yeah.
still give you antibiotics for that.
Sure.
I had strep this summer.
Depending on severity. All right, we need to move a little bit before I finish this up. So we're going to do a quick activity so we can kind of see natural selection happening in our classroom, like we saw in the video here. Ours is more of a simulation. We're not actually growing and reproducing organisms. But I need 2 volunteers for this. 2 volunteers. It's an easy job. Okay, come on down. Thank you. One more. All right, perfect. You guys are about to become birds. And you're going to be birds of the species Southwesternae broadbeckae. Okay? Southwesternae broadbeckae. And for now, I just need you to go in the hallway and chill for a moment or two. Try not to listen in on us. What table can we use? We'll just use this front table. There's a lot of us, so this might be challenging, but I want you to try and come up and get yourself around so we can see what's going on at this front table. All right. Can you see? All right. So we have this beautiful ecosystem here. Isn't that nice? Wouldn't you love to live in this ecosystem? It's very pretty. Remind me to tell you a story about when I printed this.
When you printed it? Okay.
It's almost on par with the lunch bandits.
Oh,
All right.
lunch bandit, that's a good one.
Yeah. So this ecosystem has lots of colors, and it's obviously not a natural ecosystem, but we've got a variety of insects that live here. Let me grab insects here. So we have insects, and they look like this. They're yellow, just plain colors. Spread some of them out. Okay. And these insects are happy. They're there. They're living. They have lots of food. They have lots of water. They have shelter. But what they don't have is good camouflage. And we have 2 very hungry Southwesternae broadbeckae birds that are looking forward to having these insects for their lunch. And so I'm going to have them come in. They have 30 seconds to eat. They're not really going to eat. They're going to use little tongues as their beaks to pick up as many as they can. And I just want you to make observations about what happens in this first wave of this scenario. Let me give them their beaks.
We better transfer.
All right, here come the birds.
Alright!
Here we go. 30 seconds to eat. They know how they're supposed to eat. Go ahead, guys. Just make observations.
Tyler's beak isn't helping.
All right. How did they do? Did they get a lot of bugs? Did they have plenty to eat? This is like an all-you-can-eat buffet. They didn't have to fight for it, right? They just flew around and swooped down and had lots and lots of insects. We're going to change the scenario just a little bit. So we're going to send them back. I'm going to take your insects. Thank you. Regurgitate those for me, please. Thank you. You guys go hang out in the hallway. And your instructions will be exactly the same next time we call you in. Yellow dots. Yellow dots. Or just any dots that you see, actually. We're gonna throw these off real quick. And now, we're going to have a genetic mutation occur. And we're still going to have some yellow insects. We're going to have some born with a mutation that causes them to be this color. So there's a new insect color.
Oh.
Now watch this witchcraft.
Oh!
Yeah.
Some Harry Potter stuff going on there.
We'll give them lots of these food choices. And here are their siblings that haven't received the genetic mutation. And there are way more, I made this intentional, there are way more of the different colors than the yellow ones. All right, birds! You have 30 seconds to eat any of the dots you see as you see them.
There's some rubber ones.
Go ahead. So we're witnessing natural selection in action right now. They may not even realize that they're selecting against a certain member of the species. All right, that's your time. So,
I saw like a bunch of ones came in.
hold your hands out so we can see them. Almost exclusively yellow dots, right? They went for the yellow bug because that was the easiest thing for them. The adaptation in this scenario is the coloration. The new adaptation gives an advantage to those multicolored insects. They're going to survive, they're going to reproduce, and over time we expect to see the species change to be more like those. Pretty easy concept, right? Natural selection. All right, let's grab a seat. I have just a few more things for you. I have one more video clip, and then move back over. Did you see the other ones? There's a whole bunch. Our brain doesn't have the ability to separate the circles from the backdrop if you look at the whole thing. It just makes it disappear. All right. How are we doing? So this next thing I want to talk about, survival of the fittest, isn't actually a term that Charles Darwin used, but it's a common term that we use now to talk about Charles Darwin's ideas. So I just want to talk about what survival of the fittest means and how pieces of his evolutionary theory of natural selection fit into this. Survival of the fittest refers to the genome, the genes that an organism has. Do they have genes that make them a better fit for the environment they're currently in? There's a bit of a limitation to this. If we took these multicolored insects and we moved them to a different ecosystem, now we poured all of these dots onto a white background, the ones that were the most fit now are no longer most fit. So fitness only applies to a set of circumstances that occur in one place, at one time, under one environment. Okay? So survival of the fittest doesn't mean that the organism is stronger or bigger. It means that its genes give it the traits that allow it to best survive in that environment. What I have on your paper is survival of the fittest is a natural process resulting in the evolution of species that are best adapted to their environment. We think of survival of the fittest as a combination of chance and opportunity. Chance is the mutation. It was just good luck, chance, that some of these insects were born with the multicolored shells. It was also bad luck that some were born with yellow, right? Just a random chance. There wasn't anything that said, uh-oh, this environment changed to a snowy environment, so we need these mice colors, fur colors to change. It was just chance. But that chance gives opportunity. It gives the environment opportunity to make a difference in the species by forcing winners and losers and forcing a change over time. And survival of the fittest is indicated by two things, survival and reproduction. They're both important. If an organism can survive but they don't reproduce, they're not really contributing to evolution. They're not fit because they weren't able to reproduce. Their best fit is that they can survive and they can reproduce. This quote from Charles Darwin is revealing for this concept. So even though he didn't say strongest survival of the fittest, this is what he meant. It's not the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones that are most responsive to change. The ones that, because of chance mutation, opportunity of the environment, are able to change. So where do humans fit into this? Yeah, I skipped a couple slides over there. to answer that question, we have to ask ourselves, are we as humans part of nature? Do we survive, reproduce, live according to the same rules as nature? And the answer to that is yes. If you look at our genetic code, we're wired to build proteins the same way as all other life on Earth. Plants? Yeah. So is this a real plant?
Huh?
Okay, your first day of school plant you get?
I got today.
Oh,
First,
nice.
full,
Oh,
first
okay.
full week of school.
There you go. So if we look at the DNA in that plant, it's the same as ours. It uses the same codes, maybe arranged slightly differently, but that plant builds proteins the same way. That plant uses sugar to go through cellular respiration the same way. So we get the same mechanisms. And so it would make sense that we follow the same rules. In Charles Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species, he did not fully touch on human evolution because he knew it would be such a revolutionary idea. He was already throwing a lot of stuff out there. He kind of hinted at it, but didn't come out and say that we as humans are part of nature so that we are guided by evolution and natural selection. He later published a book that did come out and say that. And so from his second book, here's a quote, we must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Basically, this is saying we, as humans, have advanced with our knowledge and our technology, but putting all that aside, at the body level, at the cell level, we follow the same rules of nature as everything else living on Earth. And the suggestion here is, why do we have all of these different traits in humans? Because we've evolved them. We've gone through many millions of years of adaptation, and we've taken earlier forms of humans, and that's changed into many multiple forms. So a couple thoughts about this. Number one, have you ever heard the expression people throw out, either for or against discussion the idea of evolution, that humans evolved from monkeys? You've probably heard that, right? So you would never hear a biologist say that. You would never hear Charles Darwin or evolutionists say that. That's not an accurate description of what we believe about human evolution. We're not saying that monkeys turned into humans. What we say is that if you look at currently living monkeys and other primates and humans, we believe that they are modified versions of something similar in our history, in our past. We have a common ancestor that through changes, because we lived in different environments, we had different experiences, natural selection causes us to separate. So we're more cousins on the tree of life than descendants of one another. So that's one misconception I want to talk about. The other is this idea that if we really did evolve and change from an early common ancestor, then remember what I said about a theory, it has to have evidence to back it up. So Charles Darwin put forth evidence looking at fossil record, looking at behavior, looking at shapes and structures on humans and chimpanzees and other close relatives, and he said, these are all strong pieces of evidence that we share a common background. If this theory is strong, then when we find new evidence, it should support that theory, right? It shouldn't refute the theory, it should support it. So 30 years ago, we developed the ability to compare DNA from various species. And what's been fascinating is when we look at how much of human DNA is similar to chimps, we get a 98% match. If we look at scientists' maps of how life should be connected, if we all evolved from a common ancestor, they had humans and chimps as the closest point based on physical features, based on where they lived, based on fossil record. On that map, we had humans and plants very far apart from one another, as you would expect. Well, the DNA matches what we expected based on our earlier observations. So the discovery of DNA has really strengthened Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, because we can now mathematically assign how closely related organisms are to one another. Do we still follow evolution? Are we still evolving through natural selection? Well, we've complicated this a little bit. We've used our knowledge to produce technology to shield us from some of the natural things that would happen. You don't have to worry when you go outside that something's going to eat you. We've figured out how to prevent that, right? You don't have to worry we don't have to worry about random, worries maybe not the right word, we don't have to worry about random mating to mix our genes. We've kind of partitioned our genes from being mixed together by choosing our mates based on preferences other than physical attributes. You don't walk out high school and look for your life partner, your life mate by saying, which one of these people have the strongest genes that are going to make sure my next generation... Right? We don't do that. Other animals do it. We don't do that. So because we've had a change in the way we look at reproduction, we've kind of slowed down human evolution. But is there evidence of evolution in us? I'm going to give you two quick examples. By the time, yeah, these are both really interesting. So the first one is skin color, and the second one is when you drink milk, what happens to you? Do you enjoy it, or do you have terrible, explosive vomit diarrhea? Right? That's a product of your evolution. So let's talk about skin color first. We know that we have this large variety of shades of skin color. We also know the reason we have them entirely has to do with natural selection. So the early humans, and actually they were a form of human, not what we look like now. They were more monkey-like than human-like in their appearance. They lived in Africa. All human life started in Africa, according to the theory of evolution. And when they lived in Africa, they had a unique environmental challenge. They were under direct, scorching sunlight all day. And direct, scorching sunlight is pretty tough if you're a fur-covered animal. It's pretty hot. And so over time, they started to lose their fur. Babies born with less fur had a better chance of not overheating and surviving, and so over millions of years in Central Africa, we lost our fur. We kept some people more than others, but it's mostly gone. Now that the fur's gone, what was underneath that fur? White skin. All of the early humans under their dark fur had white skin, which immediately became a problem. Because white skin, as opposed to darker skin, doesn't have layers of protection from ultraviolet light. So lots of our early humans were dying from what we now call cancer. They had no idea what it was at the time. And babies born with slightly darker complexions had the advantage. They were able to survive because they weren't getting these diseases, and over millions of years, all human life became very dark, dark skin. And that worked in Africa. The hair was gone, so they were cooler. The skin was darker, so that they were protected from the sunlight. But then we as early humans started to move from Africa to other parts of the world. And as we started moving away from the equator, we lost lots of hours of sunlight in the day as you moved up to northern Canada. And there is where white skin actually re-evolved, because here was a new problem. They didn't have to worry about sunlight. So that dark skin wasn't giving them an advantage protecting them from skin cancer. They had to worry about their food sources, and the food sources up in that part of the world lacked essential vitamins that they needed. And so people were getting sick and people were dying. Sunlight, we know, helps us to build some vitamins. And so babies that were born with lighter skin, just because of genetic mutation, because of variation, now had an advantage. They were able to build their own vitamins. They were healthier, stronger, they grew up, they survived. So in one part of the world, darker skin was an advantage that helped you live and reproduce. In another part of the world, lighter skin was an advantage, and so that's where we started to see this division in skin colors. And of course, if we fast forward to now, we are a global society, and we move all over the place, and we've just kept that piece of information about skin color. That means absolutely nothing other than could we have survived more or less in different parts of the world at a time long ago. That's all skin color is. Okay. The other one's milk. So back to early Africa. In early Africa, it would be a crazy idea to drink from the udders and teats of other animals. It's not just something that we did. You drank human milk from your mother, and that was that. Because we didn't drink milk, we didn't have the genes that build the proteins necessary to digest milk. And so if you don't have the genes necessary to digest milk, you get very sick. Humans were born with them. They'd last for a few months, and then those genes would shut down. And then they'd go through life not drinking milk. Some early humans started to experiment with drinking milk when food supplies were low. Most of them got sick, most of them couldn't do it. Some of them, just because of mutation, their gene never got turned off. Their milk drinking gene never got turned off, and they were still producing the lactase enzyme that digests milk. And so this thing happened where now they had an incredible advantage. They had a whole source of food that was rich in fat, rich in protein, rich in nutrients available to them through their whole life that nobody else had. And so, because that was an advantage, they passed on that gene more, and as they passed on that gene, we started to gain the ability to drink milk. But here's what's really interesting. This evolution of that gene happened after humans left Central Africa, and it happened in Europe. So Europeans and Europeans that migrated to the US have very high percentages of their population that can digest milk. If you go to Japan, or Asia, or Africa, it's less than 15% of people that can drink milk and not get sick from it without having some kind of change. Now that's been changing. In the last, as we become a global society and we've mixed genes all around the world, we're finding that percentage go up. But Europe and America are about the only place in the world where you have huge numbers of people that drink a lot of cow milk. So that's just an interesting artifact of evolution. I have a video clip I want to show you. more examples of evolution that's happening now in response to climate change. But I just kind of gave you a lot of information. Some of it was probably new, some of it might have made you feel uncomfortable even, and that's okay, that's science. If you have questions or a conversation that you'd like to have before we watch this video. Yeah?
Can you pass on something that you're allergic to?
So that's a great question. Some of our allergies are genetic. We're born with the genes to make us allergic to something. And if we're born with the gene, absolutely you can pass it to your offspring. Some allergies we develop environmentally. So for example, is it peanut butter? If you give a baby, I think it's peanut butter. So when a child's born, if you give them peanut butter before their first birthday, they actually can develop an allergy to it that they have through their life and actually don't pass that on to their offspring because it wasn't encoded in their genes from the beginning. It's actually an immune system response they've learned to develop based on the environmental factors they encounter, peanut butter. So allergies to trees and plants and pollen, yep, that's genetic, you're probably going to pass that on. A lot of food allergies we actually cause ourselves by what we eat when we're babies or when we're young, and those can't be passed on genetically.
What about penicillin and other?
Yeah, so penicillin is genetic, but it's a weird gene in that it can be turned on and off through your life, so you might not be allergic when you're a child, and then as you get older, you'd be allergic to it, or vice versa. So it is passed by genes, but there's a control mechanism that we also inherit that turns it on and off for some people. Do you have a question?
Does that mean like African American people never get skin cancer?
So it doesn't mean that. It means that they have if your skin is darker, anywhere you are in the world, if your skin is darker, you have a much lower risk of skin cancer because there's a layer of pigments. I wish I had a microscope slide to show you. So it's really neat to look at different skin colors in the microscope. There's this thick layer of pigments near the surface that provide a barrier so that UV light doesn't penetrate as far. The problem with skin cancer is UV light goes through our skin cells, it breaks the DNA, and then our body has to fix that DNA. And it's pretty good at doing that. Sometimes it makes a mistake, and then that leads to a cancer. So yeah, so the darker your skin, the lower the risk is. There's still a risk. And then, of course, that's why we put that barrier of sunscreen on to protect those cells. Good question. Yeah?
That's also why lighter skinned people like age faster because of sunlight. So because we have less pigment in our skin, dark people don't age as fast as we do.
So that's partially the case. Yeah, a lot of it's your choices you make in life as well. Smoking, wearing sunscreen. But if you were to just leave your skin untouched throughout your life, lighter skin would age more quickly because of more built-up mutations. You're right. Yeah. Good question. Other things? Do anything? Do you think I've covered what I need to for your course? All right, so let's take a look at this to kind of wrap things up. 109 or 1109. Right?
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. I have about a 5-minute clip, and then after that, we have a few minutes to wrap up. So I mentioned that we can see evolution now. One thing that's interesting is our planet has started changing at a rate much faster than we've seen in human history. And that's the result of climate change. I'm not going to jump into man-made versus natural climate change. That's a great discussion we'll have in science class. We don't have time for that today. But climate change is happening. We see our Earth's climate warming. We see as a result of that increased changed storms patterns, droughts in places that didn't have droughts, sea levels rising. This is a big deal for life on Earth because in the past, as our Earth changed slowly, remember it takes thousands or hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years for adaptations to develop through natural selection. But now, living things have to respond really quickly. We have to adapt really quickly, and that doesn't work. Natural selection is slow. So what's happening to life on Earth as our climate's changing? Well, some things are adapting a little bit. We might have to help them along a little bit. And this video kind of explores that. It's about 5 minutes long.
Rising temperatures and seas, massive droughts, changing landscapes, successfully adapting to climate change is growing increasingly important. For humans, this means using our technological advancement to find solutions, like smarter cities and better water management. But for some plants and animals, adapting to these global changes involves the most ancient solution of all: evolution. Evolutionary adaptation usually occurs along timescales of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. But in cases where species are under especially strong selective conditions, like those caused by rapidly changing climates, adaptive evolution can happen more quickly. In recent decades, we've seen many plants, animals, and insects relocating themselves and undergoing changes to their body sizes and the dates they flower or breed. But many of these are plastic or non-heritable changes to an individual's physical traits, and there are limits to how much an organism can change its own physiology to meet environmental requirements. That's why scientists are seeking examples of evolutionary changes coded in species DNA that are heritable, long-lasting, and may provide a key to their future. Take the tawny owl. If you were walking through a wintry forest in northern Europe 30 years ago, chances are you'd have heard, rather than seen, this elusive bird. Against the snowy backdrop, its plumage would have been near impossible to spot. Today, the landscape is vastly different. Since the 1980s, climate change has led to significantly less snowfall, but you'd still struggle to spot a tawny owl, because nowadays, they're brown. The brown color variant is the genetically dominant form of plumage in this species, but historically, the recessive pale gray variant triumphed because of its selective advantage in helping these predators blend in. However, less snow cover reduces opportunities for camouflage, so lately, this gray color variant has been losing the battle against natural selection. The offspring of the brown color morphs, on the other hand, have an advantage in exposed forests, so brown tawny owls are flourishing today. Several other species have undergone similar climate change adaptive genetic changes in recent decades. Pitcher plant mosquitoes have rapidly evolved to take advantage of the warmer temperatures, entering dormancy later and later in the year. Two-spot ladybug populations, once comprised of equal numbers of melanic and non-melanic morphs, have now shifted almost entirely to the non-melanic color combination. Scientists think that keeps them from overheating. Meanwhile, pink salmon have adapted to warmer waters by spawning earlier in the season to protect their sensitive eggs. And wild thyme plants in Europe are producing more repellent oils to protect themselves against the herbivores that become more common when it's warm. These plants and animals belong to a group of about 20 identified species with evolutionary adaptations to rapid climate change, including snapping turtles, wood frogs, knotweed, and silver-spotted skipper butterflies. However, scientists hope to discover more species evolving in response to climate change out of 8.7 million species on the planet. For most of our planet's astounding and precious biodiversity, evolution won't be the answer. Instead, many of those species will have to rely on us to help them survive a changing world or face extinction. The good news is we already have the tools. Across the planet, we're making on-the-ground decisions that will help entire ecosystems adapt. Critical climate refuges are being identified and set aside, and projects are underway to help mobile species move to more suitable climates. Existing parks and protected areas are also doing climate change checkups to help their wildlife cope. Fortunately, it's still within our power to preserve much of the wondrous biodiversity of this planet, which, after all, sustains us in so many ways.
Alright, so my closing thoughts about our discussion today. Evolution on Earth happens, we see it happening. It happens via natural selection. And natural selection is the driver of this. And whatever your thoughts are related to human evolution, share with you the scientific community's explanation for why we end up with so many traits and so many species on Earth. And hopefully that will be useful to you as you move through your survival of the fittest class this year. All right.
Thank you very much.